Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. There's a new bill before Parliament designed to update our privacy laws for the private sector. Bill C-27 aims to replace the 20-year-old legislation. To understand its implications, I've invited two guests. Adam Chambers is the Member of Parliament for Simcoe-North and the Deputy Shadow Minister for National Revenue. And Stephen Taylor joins us. He's a Toronto privacy lawyer. Welcome to you both. I hope you don't have any Chinese spy balloons around where you are, so hopefully the skies are clear. There we go. Gentlemen, I wanted to start off just to maybe outline what this new legislation means. Maybe Stephen, do you want to get us going on what Bill C-27 is all about?
Thank you very much, Tony, for having me here. I look forward to talking about Bill C-27 with you and Adam. Obviously, the opinions I express are my opinions. I'm not providing any legal advice in our conversation. Look, Bill C-27 is very important. It is a fundamental overhaul to the Canadian privacy legislation known as PIPEDA. Canada is moving, in my opinion, into a direction more closely like what we see in Europe with the GDPR and like what we see in, for example, California with CCPA. If and when Bill C-27 passes, it will create what's called the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. And in short, it's going to increase privacy rights for consumers, for Canadian consumers. It's also going to add new enforcement procedures and create new penalties and punishments, frankly, for not complying with privacy legislation. This is a bold step for Canada. It's moving us, I think, more in line with some of our international allies' legislation like we see in the US and in Europe. It's much needed. So I think in the privacy community, we welcome this legislation.
Fantastic to get your viewpoint there. Adam, maybe give us your perspective on this. Is this legislation necessary, and if so, why?
Well, it is, as mentioned by Stephen, one of a more significant overhaul of legislation in a long period of time. The technological changes, just even in the last 5 years, especially with respect to things like artificial intelligence, and we're all seeing some of these fascinating capabilities that artificial intelligence can do, and that's just developments in the last few years. So this area of technological development has been moving very quickly, and so there are some welcome updates and significant measures. Of course, data itself and personal privacy, everyone should have a right or ought to have a right to this personal privacy or a data right, as has been the case in some other jurisdictions going down that line of reasoning. In addition, increased powers for the privacy commissioner are welcome in most cases. I would also, make a link back to some of the government actions in the Emergencies Act and how the privacy commissioner is examining that, looking at how the government itself used people's personal information. But we want to make sure also there are no loopholes that are unintentionally created so that Canadians can have significant confidence in the way that their information is being used by corporations or the level of disclosure that they receive that lets them know how information may be used by some of the corporations and entities that hold their information.
Oh, that's interesting. We'll certainly unpack that as the show comes along. Adam, we got about Stephen, we've got about a minute before the break. Are you seeing in this legislation things that could help with some of the issues surrounding AI and deep fakes and all these other things that are going on?
Absolutely, and Adam is spot on to highlight the importance of AI coming under this legislation. I mean, Henry Kissinger just wrote a very interesting book recently called The Age of AI, which in a nutshell says that this is a revolutionary change for our society, and having legislation in Canada that keeps up with these AI developments is very important. For example, we see under the legislation that Canada is looking at creating an artificial intelligence data commissioner. This is tremendously important.
That is very interesting. There's more that we can unpack after we take a little bit of a break. We are going to do this at this time. We'll be back with our guests after the break. Please stay with us. Adam, maybe just give us a sense. Obviously, you're in the opposition caucus. There's been some privacy issues in our society, in our country. What are you looking for in this legislation that will help protect the privacy of individuals?
Well, first, speaking, personally as a member of parliament, not necessarily on behalf of the party, of course, I'm looking for a few things. One, I mentioned earlier, the recognition of a data right for individuals is very important. At the same time, I think this is going to be a balance between the requirements that we place on businesses, in particular small businesses, to conform with legislation. And so we want to be careful about not creating unnecessary burdens with respect to the level of additional red tape, if you will, on small businesses. So there has to be some common sense applied to what we're going to be asking industry to do. In addition, I think there's opportunities perhaps to strengthen legislation. There are carve-outs right now for corporations, in particular financial institutions, to share information with each other in cases of suspected fraud. One of the things I've been hearing a lot about, especially on the money laundering file, is to allow financial institutions to share information with each other in cases of suspected money laundering. That is not dealt in the legislation, but is one of these issues that is, fraud and money laundering is a huge issue right across this country, upwards of $100 billion a year. So I'd say that there's some common sense tweaks and suggestions of potential amendments that you could see come to this legislation. And of course, on the AI front, Canada has a little bit of an edge when it comes to AI. We want to make sure that any regulations recognize that we want a strong artificial intelligence industry in Canada and not make it so that companies don't want to invest in Canada because it's too overbearing. So it's all about finding that balance between respecting people's privacy and data rights, but also recognizing we want to create an environment where businesses and private sector can thrive.
Stephen Taylor, does this bill then strike the right balance, as Adam is talking about? Or are you confident that privacy rights can be maintained, but also some of these legitimate public policy goals, preventing fraud, as Adam mentioned, can be achieved as well?
Well, we'll see. A lot of members of the legal community in Canada, when asked about Bill C-27 and the future of the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, are waiting to see what Parliament does with this legislation when it will pass. There have been some comments around the length it's taking for the legislation to be debated, developed. I think there probably needs to be more stakeholder conversations with parliamentarians, both from a consumer and a business side, to iron out the details and go through what some of these challenges for businesses can be. But one point I will say that is in the draft legislation, certainly for consumer protection, the legislation proposes fines of up to $25 million or 5% of global turnover.
Right.
This is very similar to what we see under GDPR in Europe. So for companies, particularly big companies who blatantly violate privacy laws, Canada now has the ability with this legislation, when it comes into force, to really give out some pretty strong fines. So we'll see how that gets developed and how the enforcement agencies actually implement their ability to fine companies. Will they issue really large fines, or will they hold back a bit? That's to be determined.
Yeah, so I guess that's one of the big issues is what are the impacts of non-compliance, right? Like, is this legislation going to have teeth? And you make the point, you can have the teeth in legislation, but if it's not actually applied, it really is a paper tiger. Is that what you're concerned about, Stephen?
I think that's right. I think we need to know more. What will the mandate be for the enforcement agency? This legislation, in addition to creating an AI data commissioner, it will also create an enlarged privacy commissioner with additional powers. And it would be interesting to scrutinize a little bit what the mandate of that agency is, and how they're going to enforce this legislation, because this agency will have a very large amount of power, who to prosecute, how much to charge, fines. There's also quasi-criminal prosecution being mentioned in Bill C-27 for violation of the legislation. So I think more discussion needs to happen. And frankly, I'm surprised this legislation isn't getting more coverage in the press, because
Right.
this is really a fundamental overhaul of
Indeed.
PIPEDA, and will impact all businesses in Canada that process personal
Sure.
information.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. We're going to take a brief break with our guests. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Adam, let's talk a little bit about the criticisms, either from the opposition benches or more broadly. Are parts of this legislation too broad, or are there things that are ill-defined? What are your concerns?
Well, I think in general, I mean, from a principle perspective, many of the things that Stephen mentioned about what's good about the legislation, it makes sense. We need to modernize the legislation, of course. Again, it's about finding the balance between, say, the additional burdens you might put on a business, in particular, small business. So, for example, the requirement for every business to have a privacy watchdog. What does that really mean? Is this every business, regardless of size? How does that work in terms of the costs associated with compliance? So really making sure that we fully understand or are reasonable in the requests that we're going to be putting on, in particular, small business. Understandably, those large organizations likely have the capacity to handle any of these significant changes. But from a small business perspective, we want to make sure that these requests are not overburdensome. So, there's probably some opportunity to better define the application, but also make sure that we're not really making unnecessary additional unnecessary requests on small business. As well, there's other areas that I mentioned one earlier that this legislation does not touch, that maybe it should, with respect to fraud and money laundering, because that's been an ask from both industry and stakeholders across the country in terms of making it easier to catch money launderers. There's lots of examples of an individual or an organization who's been turned away from one financial institution because they are suspected in money laundering activity, just to walk across the street to continue that activity. So I think there's a couple examples that you might see some discussion on. I agree with Stephen. I think there should be more discussion in the general public about this bill, because it is such a significant overhaul.
Stephen, I understand that there's language in the bill that talks about socially beneficial purposes that maybe is a catch-all phrase or a loophole. Can you talk a little bit about that and its importance?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that definitely needs to be examined, and we probably need more explanation around that. But one point I think that's important to know, and picking up on the small business aspect and consumer protection aspect, is the introduction of a concept called legitimate interest into this legislation, which, again, in our friends in Europe in GDPR, this is a common ground used for processing personal data in the absence of consent. I think this will help small businesses and even large businesses to some extent, because it's going to enable them to process consumer personal information when there's a legitimate interest to do so. They don't need to get the consent in every case. So this will make it a little bit easier for businesses to process personal information. And consumers can rest assured that under legitimate interest, there's a very strict test, that the company using legitimate interest, for example, would have to pass in advance of processing data on those grounds. So I think this is a good balance between giving business some agility while at the same time protecting consumer social rights. But we'll see how Canadian courts interpret the use of legitimate interest. But it's quite frequently used in Europe in the absence of consent.
And would that be anonymized data, Stephen?
It would apply to personal information of
Okay.
consumers. So this legislation is going down the path like we see in Europe. But on the point of anonymized data, Tony, the legislation does codify requirements for companies, small businesses to anonymize and de-identify personal information when it's no longer necessary to process for the purpose it was collected for. Again, we see this kind of legislation in the CCPA in California and also in GDPR. This is, I think, a positive development because it streamlines, especially for global companies, the legislation in Canada with these other jurisdictions. And as we know, the processing of data now has become such a large global activity. It's often rare for multinational companies to process data of only one data subject in one country. So this, I think, is going to help consumers in Canada and businesses in Canada. But again, the devil's often in the details.
In the details, exactly. We're going to take another brief break. We'll be back with our guests after that. Please stay with us. We're back here at Boom and Bust talking about privacy legislation, Bill C-27, with our guests, Member of Parliament Adam Chambers and Stephen Taylor, privacy lawyer. Gentlemen, I'm going to both ask both of you this question. Maybe start with you, Adam. Obviously, there's a lot that's going to affect businesses. You mentioned small enterprises, Adam. How should businesses in Canada prepare for this legislation, do you think?
Well, at this stage, I mean, you have to remain informed at the very least. You have to understand or seek to understand, follow the discussion to figure out how some of these changes might affect you and how some of the ways that you deal with how these businesses deal with personal information today, how would that change? Are there circumstances under which you think need to be elevated to be part of the discussion to figure out how they can be best dealt with, or how we balance these rights out in terms of the right of the consumer, also the burden that we're placing on business. So that's important. You need to stay informed. You need to maybe have a connection with your local member of parliament or maybe a trade association that would be part of this discussion as a stakeholder to help form really how this legislation is not just going to be finalized, but potentially even implemented once it's there. So I think staying informed is the most important part at this stage in the process.
Stephen Taylor, anything else businesses should be doing?
Look, I agree with Adam's thoughts. I would almost turn the table a bit and encourage the government and parliamentarians to do more to notify businesses of the legislation. I think guidance notes, like we see with GDPR, there's very thick guidance notes on what a lot of the legislation means. I really hope that our parliamentarians can push the government to have a business-friendly approach to introducing the legislation, because it's going to have such an impact on how companies do business. We really need to have more guidance, more updates from this government on what they're intending to do with this legislation, because it's been a very slow process.
Absolutely.
Adam, I noticed that there's another bill before Parliament, Bill C-26. We've been talking about C-27. C-26 deals with cybersecurity. Are you aware of how those two interrelate at all?
Not in the intricate details, of course, but I would just say if you step back as a Canadian, one of the most important themes that most people should be thinking about is personal privacy and security. I think there needs to be a much broader conversation in this country. If you look at the conversation, for example, in the United States with respect to how social media platforms are using data, where it's being stored, who has access to the data. In some cases, a foreign government, hostile government may have access to information. I actually think there needs to be a much broader conversation in Canada instead of what seems to be people just kind of moving along, not really fully understanding the implications of, these very important issues, cybersecurity and personal protection and data privacy. In many cases, Canadians don't even fully understand what kinds of information are being captured or what they're willingly giving up to some of these I'll call them applications.
Indeed. Stephen, any comments about the interplay with cybersecurity?
Again, I think Adam's spot on. I would just say that we're living in a digital age. Data protection and privacy law go hand in hand with cybersecurity, information technology, security. Let's hope that the government creates legislation in cybersecurity that that make it easy for business and consumers to understand and apply. I think protecting data today and in the market is one of the most important elements of any company. I think I read in the Wall Street Journal the other day that we're seeing a lot of cybersecurity crime throughout North America. This has been going up over the last few years. So obviously, I think in Canada, the tougher the legislation is around cybersecurity crime, the better off our companies and consumers will be. Look, it's very difficult to keep up with the technological advancements through legislation. So we really need legislation that is bold and agile to keep up with these security threats. So I think it's a hugely important topic, and it doesn't get enough coverage. I agree with Adam.
Well, we might have to have both of you back to expand on some of these things as the legislation proceeds. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Interesting discussion today with our guests. Thanks for joining us.